This is big picture anatomy with a quick look at how the lungs work to get oxygen into the blood. Air enters into the lung through the trachea and goes down the trachea, which then branches into the primary bronchi, one that goes to the left lung and one that goes to the right lung. The primary bronchi then branch into smaller and smaller bronchi until eventually you get to the smallest bronchioles, which end at what we call the alveoli or air sacs. Tiny microscopic sacs inside the lungs. They fill the entire lung, and this is where the oxygen actually passes into the blood, which we'll take a look at in a minute. First, though, let's take a look at how the diaphragm actually works to bring air down into the lungs. The diaphragm is this flat sheet of muscle that lies just inferior to the lungs. It forms a seal at the inferior part of the chest cavity with the ribs coming up around the lungs on either side and separates the pleural cavity or chest cavity from the underlying abdominal cavity. When the diaphragm, this flat sheet of muscle, contracts, it pulls in from a central tendon region and actually pulls inferiorly, creating a vacuum in the pleural cavity. In order to fill that vacuum, the air has to rush down through the trachea and out to every part of the lung. So that's how air enters into the lungs upon inhalation or inspiration. In order for air to leave the lungs, what happens is the lung tissue itself has many, many elastic fibers and is very rubbery or elastic. And those elastic fibers just contract and the lungs shrink up and the air is expelled from the lung upon exhalation or expiration. The abdominal muscles that wrap around the abdominal cavity, those external and internal obliques and transversus muscles, can actually compress the abdominal cavity and also push up on the diaphragm, expelling air forcefully out of the lungs. This most commonly happens when we cough or sneeze. The intercostal muscles between the ribs surrounding the lungs and the rib cage can also help with respiration, depending on which ones are active, opening or closing the rib cage a little bit to help with air moving in and out of the lungs. Let's take a closer look now at what happens in the alveolar sacs once the air gets there and how oxygen in the alveolar sacs moves into the bloodstream. To do that, we're going to take a closer look at the alveolus itself and see what's happening. When the air makes it into the now microscopic alveolus, this is a magnified view of an alveolus here. When that air laden with oxygen makes it into the alveolus, what the alveolus looks like is a very simple epithelial-lined sac. It's a simple squamous epithelial tissue that's surrounding the alveolus, right in its external membrane there. And specifically what makes up that lining of the alveolar sac are some simple squamous cells that we call type 1 pneumocytes. Remember, pneumo refers to the lungs, and these are the principal cells of the lung that line all of the alveolar sacs. That means it's a very short distance now for the oxygen to diffuse right across those simple squamous cells and into a capillary. This is one single capillary. The entire alveolar structure would be surrounded by a huge network of capillaries all around it. And the lining of the capillary cells, the outside of the capillary itself, is also a simple squamous epithelial lining, making what we call the endothelium, or the lining of the capillary itself. So now the oxygen can quickly diffuse across the simple squamous lining of the alveolar sac, the simple squamous lining of the capillary, and into the blood, which is moving through the capillary itself. The capillaries are so tiny that all that really fits through a capillary is pretty much a single file of red blood cells. Red blood cells are among the simplest cells in the body. They're really just little sacs packed with hemoglobin. They don't have a nucleus or mitochondria or anything. There's this big sacs full of hemoglobin, which we've abbreviated as HB here. And hemoglobin has an affinity for oxygen. It's a protein that carries oxygen. And so those oxygen molecules combine with hemoglobin molecules inside each one of these red blood cells. The scale of this is way beyond what we're seeing here in the drawing. I've labeled a few hemoglobin molecules, but every one of these tiny red blood cells is filled with about 250 million hemoglobin molecules, so they're able to take up a tremendous amount of oxygen. The result then is that what we see coming into the capillary, so blood coming into the capillary, from the pulmonary arteries is very low in oxygen. It has a partial pressure of about 400 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. And after it passes around the alveolar sac and picks up all that oxygen as it is leaving, it now has a partial pressure of about 100 millimeters of oxygen, which is really the total capacity of the blood to carry oxygen. And is about equal with the partial pressure of the oxygen in the air, which is also about 100 millimeters of mercury. So it's a very effective means to pick up a lot of oxygen as those red blood cells pass by the alveolar sacs, and the oxygen diffuses across two very thin layers of cells right into the red blood cells where the hemoglobin carries the oxygen to the pulmonary veins, where it goes back to the heart and then out to the rest of the body. So that's a nice review of the total process by which oxygen gets into the blood and the role of the lungs in doing that. Just a quick wrap up. Air comes into the lungs through the trachea, branches out through primary bronchi and bronchioles out into the alveolar sacs. There is pulled into the lungs by the diaphragm, contracting inferiorly. There is expelled from the lungs by elastic fibers in the lungs, shrinking the lungs back down to their smaller size. Once the air is out into those alveolar sacs, that's where oxygen can easily diffuse across the thin lining, squamous cell lining of the alveolar sacs, across the simple squamous cells of the capillary, and into the red blood cells, where it is combines with the hemoglobin and is carried back to the rest of the body. That's how the lungs work from big picture anatomy.